The morning Sallie Lawson rode into Caldwell, Kansas with a bullet hole in her left shoulder, and a dying man draped across the saddle of her borrowed horse. Not a single soul in that sun-baked town of 1,800 souls stepped forward to help her. It was the autumn of 1879, and the cattle drives were winding down for the season, leaving Caldwell in that peculiar lull between the roar of summer commerce and the deep quiet of winter. The main street was dusty and wide enough for 3 wagons to pass abreast, and on either side stood the wooden facades of saloons and general stores, and a barber who doubled as a dentist when the occasion demanded. Men leaned against posts and watched her come in. Women drew their shawls tighter and looked away. Children pointed until their mothers pulled their hands down. Sallie did not slow her horse for any of them. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair that had come half loose from its braid during what had clearly been a very bad morning. Her green eyes were sharp and a little glassy from pain, but her jaw was set in a way that told anyone who looked closely that she had decided she would not fall off this horse, and that was a decision she intended to honor. Her left arm hung awkward and close to her side. Her right hand held the reins with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding before she could properly walk. The man across the other horse was Walt Briggs, a homesteader from 7 miles southeast of town, and he was not yet dead, but was working toward it with considerable commitment. He had taken a rifle shot to his side that morning, when 3 riders from the Cutter outfit had decided that the fence Walt had put up along the south boundary of his claim was an affront to their cattle's personal freedom. Walt had a wife and 2 small boys at home, and when the riders had come and the shooting had started, Sallie had been the one delivering eggs from her own small farm to Walt's doorstep. She had not planned to be heroic. She had planned to sell eggs, but Walt had gone down and the riders had turned their attention to her, and something in Sallie Lawson simply refused to be frightened out of doing what was right. She had grabbed Walt's horse, hauled him up with her good arm while the bad one screamed at her, and ridden hard for Caldwell while rifle shots cracked the morning air behind her. She stopped in front of the doctor's office because she had seen the painted sign from the end of the street, and she said, loudly and without particular drama, "Someone help me get this man down." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came from the side of the street, from the alley between the feed store and the harness shop, a low voice with a southwestern drawl worn smooth by years of trail dust and open sky. "I have got him." The man who stepped out of that alley was not the largest man Sallie had ever seen, but he moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that made him seem larger than he was. He was perhaps 28, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they can, with dark hair that curled a little under the brim of a battered gray hat. His face was clean-shaved along the jaw, but he had not been meticulous about it, and his eyes, when they found hers, were a warm, steady brown that held neither judgment nor pity, only attention. He wore a brown canvas duster over plain working clothes, and his boots were the boots of a man who had walked considerable country in them. He went straight to Walt's horse, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, and called over his shoulder to a boy who had been watching from the feed store doorway. "Go get Dr. Prentice. Tell him it's a gut shot and it's been maybe 2 hours. Go now, son." The boy went. The man lifted Walt Briggs down from the horse with careful hands and carried him up the 2 steps to the doctor's office as though he had done this kind of thing before, which he had, though he did not think it worth mentioning. Sallie climbed down from her own horse more slowly, steadying herself against the saddle with her right hand, and by the time she had both feet on the ground, the man was back in the doorway. "You need to come inside too," he said. "I am fine. You have blood running down your left arm and you have been holding it still for what looks like about 2 hours. You are not fine. Come inside." She looked at him for a moment, measuring him with those sharp green eyes. He did not look away, and he did not soften his expression into the patronizing gentleness she had learned to recognize as the particular brand of condescension men offered women in situations where they felt women should be weeping instead of riding. He just looked back at her, even and direct, and waited. She came inside. Dr. Prentice was a round-faced man of 50, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the hands of someone who had performed difficult work in difficult conditions for a long time. He went to Walt first, which was right, and the man in the duster stood in the corner of the waiting room and did not make conversation while Sallie pressed a folded cloth to her shoulder and sat very straight in the hard wooden chair. After a while he said, "Ezekiel Barlow, most people call me Zeke." "Sallie Lawson," she said. "Most people call me Trouble, though I did not ask them to." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Where did you come from this morning?" he asked. "My farm, southeast quarter 6 miles out. I was making a delivery." She paused. "3 riders from the Cutter outfit shot Walt and came after me. I do not know if they followed." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will check on your horses and take a look down the street." "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to." He went out, and Sallie sat alone in the wooden chair and breathed carefully through the pain in her shoulder and thought about the fact that this was the second time in her life a strange man had helped her without being asked and without wanting anything obvious in return. The first had been her father, and he had been dead for 3 years. Ezekiel came back in 10 minutes and told her the street was quiet. Both horses were tied properly and had water, and that he had asked Sheriff Dolan to ride out toward the Cutter spread as a precautionary measure. Sallie absorbed this information and said nothing, because the thing she wanted to say, which was something along the lines of "thank you. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time," felt too large for this particular room. Dr. Prentice came out from the back room, removed his spectacles, and polished them with the corner of his coat. "Walt Briggs is stable for the moment. It did not perforate the bowel, which is the only reason we are not having a different conversation. He will need several weeks of rest and no lifting, and his wife should be sent for. Now," he replaced his spectacles and looked at Sallie, "you, young woman, in the back." The bullet had gone through cleanly, which was the best possible outcome, and Prentice cleaned and bound the wound with brisk efficiency, while Sallie sat on his examination table and did not make any sound that could be described as distress. When it was done, she pulled her shirt back up over her shoulder and buttoned it and slid down from the table. "You will need to rest that arm for at least 2 weeks, Prentice said. "I have a farm to run." "Yes, and you will run it poorly if you pull those stitches loose and the wound goes septic. 2 weeks, Miss Lawson, I am not negotiating." Ezekiel was still in the waiting room when she came out. She had half expected him to be gone. He was sitting on one of the chairs with his hat on his knee, and he looked up when she appeared. "He fix you up well enough." "Good." He stood and put his hat on. "You got someone to take you home?" "I have 2 horses." "That is not what I asked." She looked at him with the directness that had made people uncomfortable her entire life, the particular unblinking quality of a woman who had learned very young that looking away was how you got caught short. "No," she said, "I do not have someone to take me home." "Then I will take you." She started to object, and he said, quietly but with the same even certainty he had used earlier, "You have a hole in your shoulder, and you have been riding hard under stress for 2 hours. If you fall off your horse on the way home, there will be nobody to find you. Let me take you." She did not fall off horses. But she understood his logic, and more than that, she was suddenly very tired in a way that went down to her bone marrow, and the thought of someone else being responsible for the next hour felt, against her better judgment, like an enormous relief. "All right," she said. They rode out of Caldwell in the warm late morning light, Sallie on her own horse and Ezekiel on a black gelding she had not noticed before, leading Walt's horse behind. She told him the way, and he followed it without commentary, and for a long stretch they rode in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Most silences with strangers felt like something to be filled. This one felt like something to rest in. "You work cattle?" she asked finally, because she was curious about him, and curiosity had always been stronger in her than caution. "Was 3 years on the Kishom doing trail work. Came off the drives last spring when the cattle market dropped." He glanced at her sideways. "I have been doing day work where I can get it, looking to put together enough to try for a piece of land. Homestead land. If the railroad does not gobble it up first." There was a flatness in his voice when he said that, not bitterness exactly, but the particular weary acknowledgement of a man who understood how the game was played and who had very limited resources with which to play it. Sallie nodded. She understood that flatness intimately. She had felt it herself during the 2 years she had spent fighting the land office over her father's claim after he died, fighting the men who assumed a woman alone could not possibly hold the land, fighting the quiet erosion of people who were supposed to help her but who found it easier not to. "How did you come to farm out here alone?" he asked. She told him, which surprised her, because she did not usually tell people things. Her father, James Lawson, had come down to Kansas from Missouri in 1872, purchased 160 acres under the Homestead Act, and spent 6 years turning raw prairie into something that could be called a farm. Her mother had died of cholera in 1874, and after that it had been Sallie and her father and the land. When James Lawson died of a heart attack in November of 1876, Sallie had been 21 years old, and she had simply continued. There had been legal challenges, 3 of them from neighboring landholders who believed a young woman alone could not maintain the requirements of the Homestead Act. She had answered each challenge in writing, documented everything that was required, and won each time. 3 challenges, Ezekiel said when she had finished. 3. And you answered them all. I had to. It was my land. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he seemed to say most things. "That is remarkable, Sallie." She turned to look at him. Nobody called her by her first name without being invited to do so, and nobody had used remarkable to describe her in her memory. Strong-willed, they said, stubborn, difficult. One man at the land office had called her unnatural, which she had taken in the privacy of her own heart as a compliment because the things he called natural she found deeply uninspiring. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know enough. 3 legal challenges, a bullet in your shoulder. You still got that man to the doctor." He looked at her steadily. "That is remarkable." She faced forward again and did not say anything for a while, but something had shifted inside her, something small and quiet and stubborn as a seed pushed up through cold ground. Her farm was modest but ordered. A frame house, a barn, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden, and about 40 acres of winter wheat she had put in the ground the previous month. Ezekiel helped her put the horses up without being asked, moving through her barn with the practical ease of a man who had spent his life around animals and knew how to be useful in someone else's space without being intrusive. She made coffee on the wood stove, and they sat at her kitchen table, while the afternoon light came through the windows at a long angle, and she told him about the cutter outfit because she thought he should know the particulars if he was doing day work in the area. The cutter operation was a large cattle enterprise run by a man named Harold Cutter, who had decided some years ago that the fencing of the open range was a personal insult directed at him by the entire homesteading community. He was not a violent man by nature, his riders sometimes were, and the 3 who had come to Walt Briggs's claim that morning had been riding on Cutter's orders, though those orders had likely not specified shooting. "They will not come after you again?" Ezekiel asked. "They might, they have before. Minor things, fences cut, a gate left open that let my cattle out." She paused. "I keep a rifle by the door. Have you talked to Sheriff Dahlin?" 4 times in 2 years. Dahlin is sympathetic and ineffective. It is a common combination. She looked down at her coffee cup. "The law out here is slow and the range men are fast. That is just the reality of it." Ezekiel turned his hat in his hands, a slow, thoughtful motion. "Who works your place with you?" "I hire 2 men part-time during planting and harvest. The rest of the year it is just me." He looked around the kitchen, at the careful order of it, the clean shelves, the repaired hinges on the cabinet doors, the way everything showed the marks of constant and competent maintenance. "You need a full-time hand," he said. "I cannot afford a full-time hand." room and board plus a small wage. I am not looking for luxury. She stared at him. He looked back with that same steady brown gaze that gave nothing away except basic honesty. You are suggesting you work here, she said. I am looking for work and you clearly need someone. It seems logical. You do not know anything about me. I know enough, he said again, and there was something in the repetition of it, the same words in the same tone, that made her stomach do a thing she had not expected it to do. She said she would think about it, which meant she spent that night lying awake in her narrow bed listening to the wind come off the prairie and thinking about what it would mean to have someone else on her land, in her space, threaded into the daily pattern of her life. She had been alone for 3 years. She had built the aloneness into something she could live inside, had made it functional, had stopped thinking of it as lack and started thinking of it as freedom. But the freedom had a cost she did not often let herself count, which was that some mornings the silence of the house sat on her chest like a stone. She told him yes in the morning. He moved into the small room off the back of the barn that had been her father's workshop, cleared of tools now, and made it habitable with a cot and a small iron stove and his own bedroll. He had very few possessions: a change of clothes, a good knife, a well-worn Bible he kept on the windowsill but she never saw him actually read, and a photograph tucked into the pages of the Bible that she caught a glimpse of once, a man and a woman in front of a small house, older, clearly his parents, and she did not ask. What he had in abundance was capability. He knew cattle and horses with the deep instinctive fluency of someone trained from childhood. He could read weather, fix fence, mend harness, and coax a recalcitrant windmill back to operation. He was up before dawn and he did not stop moving until the work was done and the light was gone. He was not a man who required management or supervision or the kind of careful social navigation that exhausted Sallie's interactions with most people. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. She found this extraordinary and slightly unnerving. Within 2 weeks they had fallen into a working rhythm so easy that she sometimes lost track of the fact that it was new, that he had not always been here, that the sound of him moving through the barn in the early morning and the sight of his hat on the peg by the door were recent additions to her world. She cooked in the evenings and they ate together at the kitchen table, and the conversations they had during those meals were the best conversations she could remember having since her father died. He was curious about everything in the way of people who have educated themselves against odds, reading whatever came to hand, thinking hard about what they read. He had opinions about the cattle market and the railroad land grants and the drought cycles of the southern plains and the politics of the Indian Territory to their south, where the 5 civilized tribes were being pressed on their own land, even as homesteaders like Sallie were pressed on theirs. He thought the injustices were related, different expressions of the same underlying force, which was the tendency of the powerful to take from those who could not stop them. "You sound like a newspaper editor," she told him one evening. "I sound like a man who has ridden through a lot of country and paid attention," he said. She laughed, which was something she had not done enough of in 3 years. He was careful with her. Not in the way of men who handle women as though they are made of china, not in that patronizing softness, but careful in the sense of being genuinely attentive, noticing things. He noticed when her shoulder was bothering her without her saying so, because she held herself differently, and on those evenings he would find something that needed doing inside or close to the house, so she did not have to reach or lift. He noticed when she was worried about the wheat, because she would go stand at the edge of the field in the late afternoon and look at it with a particular quality of stillness, and he would come stand beside her, and sometimes they would talk about it, and sometimes they would just stand there and let the silence be what it was. The shoulder healed. The wheat came in green and promising through November. The Cutter riders stayed away, which Sallie attributed to the fact that Ezekiel's presence on the property was now visible and known, and there was something about the way he carried himself that communicated, without aggression, that this would not be an easy place to cause trouble. She asked him about his family one evening in December, when a sharp blue norther had driven them both inside early and snow was beginning to pile on the windowsills. He told her his father had been a cattleman in South Texas, near San Antonio, and his mother a schoolteacher from Georgia who had gone west with considerably more optimism than the situation warranted. Both parents had died of influenza in the winter of 1872 when Ezekiel was 21, leaving him a small inheritance that had not survived a bad cattle investment and a partner who turned out to have flexible ideas about honesty. "Is that when you went on the drives?" she asked. "Yes, had nothing else to do with myself. Thought moving might be better than standing still." "Was it?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "For a while," he said. "The trail teaches you things, but it is not a life you can build on. You are always going somewhere else, never being somewhere." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm and the stove was ticking with heat and the snow was coming down outside, and it occurred to her in a sudden and overwhelming way that she wanted him to stay. Not just through the winter, not just through the planting season, not just as a hired hand. She wanted him to be here, in this kitchen, in this life, in the long, permanent sense of the word. The realization frightened her, because she had not wanted that in a long time and she had gotten comfortable not wanting it, and wanting things made you vulnerable in a way that going without did not. She said nothing. She poured more coffee and changed the subject to the spring planting schedule, and he followed her lead, as he often did, because he was perceptive enough to notice when she was retreating and generous enough not to pursue. But he knew something had shifted. He had known since about the third week of October, when he had come around the corner of the barn and found her standing in the early morning light with her hair down, the long auburn braid having come loose overnight, and she had looked up at him startled, and then simply looked back with those clear eyes, and he had felt the bottom drop out of something in his chest in a way that was not entirely comfortable. He had been careful. He was a man on her land, in her employ, with limited resources and no permanent address, and she was a woman who had fought very hard for her independence and who clearly valued it more than almost anything. The last thing he wanted to be was another complication in a life that had already had too many, but the care was becoming more difficult to maintain. In January, there was a hard freeze that threatened the dormant wheat and required 3 days of constant attention to the water lines and the windmill and the livestock. They worked those 3 days nearly without sleep, tag-teaming the necessary tasks, and at the end of the third day, when the freeze had broken and the immediate danger had passed, they were both sitting on the floor of the barn because the hay was clean and dry, and their legs had simply given out, and Sallie rested her head against his shoulder without thinking about it, and he very carefully did not move in case moving would make her aware of what she had done and cause her to stop. She was asleep in less than 3 minutes. He stayed still for a very long time in the quiet barn with the frost retreating from the walls and the animals settling around them, and he thought about what it meant to feel at home somewhere, and how he had not felt that in quite a long time, and how the feeling was specific and irreplaceable and terrifying. She woke up 40 minutes later with a sharp intake of breath, lifted her head, and looked at him. Her hair was loose again, which it did when she was working hard and had no time for vanity, and her cheek had the faint impression of the canvas of his duster. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything, and then she stood up and went to check on the chickens, and he went to see about the windmill. But things had changed, in the way that things change when two people stop pretending not to know what they both know. February came in cold and still. On a clear Sunday afternoon when the ground was frozen hard, but the sky was a startling deep blue, Ezekiel asked her if she would like to ride with him to the south quarter to check the fence line, which she knew perfectly well did not need checking, because they had checked it 6 days ago and nothing had disturbed it since. She said yes anyway, and they rode out, and at the far south end of her land where the Cutter territory began and the fence wire ran bright silver against the dead winter grass, they stopped their horses and sat looking at the line of the horizon. "Sallie," he said. She turned to look at him. He was quiet for a moment, as though gathering something, choosing the arrangement of words that would be both true and sufficient. Then he said, "I am going to say something, and I need you to hear it without arguing it down before I have finished saying it. I do not argue things down. You do. You are very good at it. Please, for just a moment, do not." She pressed her lips together and waited. "I have been trying to think of how to say this without it sounding like something it is not," he said. "So I will just say it plain. I have never known a woman like you. I have never known a person, man or woman, with the kind of courage you have. Not the loud kind, not the performing kind, but the real kind. The kind that gets up every morning and does what needs doing even when it is hard, and even when nobody is watching, and even when nobody helps." He paused. "You are the bravest person in this territory, Sallie. And I do not think anyone has ever told you that, and I think they should have, a long time ago." The wind came across the open ground and moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and looked at him and felt something break open inside her chest in a way that was not painful, but was very much like the feeling of a window that has been sealed shut for years finally being pushed up into the fresh air. "Ezekiel," she said, "I am not finished." She waited. "I am not a wealthy man, and I do not have land of my own, and I cannot offer you very much materially speaking," he said, his voice carrying the low, careful honesty of a man who is telling the whole truth whether it helps him or not. "But I am asking if there is any part of you that thinks you might feel something for me, because if the answer is no, I will understand it and I will still be here in the spring and I will not make it strange. But if the answer is not no, then I would like to know that." She had spent 3 years making decisions alone, practical decisions, financial decisions, legal decisions, decisions about livestock and weather and soil. She had gotten very competent at it. But this particular decision came up through her body before her mind had finished evaluating it, and what came up was entirely clear. "The answer is not no," she said. He let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 3 months. She reached across the small, cold distance between their horses and put her right hand in his left hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stayed that way for a while in the blue winter afternoon with the frozen prairie running away in all directions and the fence wire catching the low sunlight. "You said I am the bravest person in the territory," she said eventually. "I did. That is a considerable claim. I stand by it." She squeezed his hand once and then let go, because the horses were getting restless, and they turned back toward the farm side by side. But something had settled between them now, something with weight and permanence, something that felt less like a beginning than like a recognition of something that had been true for a while already and had simply been waiting for the right words. The courtship that followed was quiet and unhurried and deeply comfortable, which suited them both. There was no grand performance of it, no formal calling, no elaborate rituals. It expressed itself in small, accumulated things. The way he brought her coffee in the mornings before she had asked for it, the way she saved him the piece of pie she knew he preferred, the conversations that went long into the evenings and left them both reluctant for the lamp to go out, the particular quality of attention they had for each other that was visible to anyone watching, but that neither of them felt the need to announce. He kissed her for the first time in March, in the kitchen, in the middle of an argument about whether the south field should be planted with wheat again, or whether this was the year to try corn. And she had been making a particularly emphatic point, and had turned to find him very close, closer than she had expected, and the argument had dissolved the way morning fog dissolves, and he had kissed her with the same serious and complete attention he gave to everything else in his life. She kissed him back with rather more enthusiasm than she had planned, which surprised them both. "I was making an argument," she said, when they had separated. "I know, finish it." "I cannot remember what it was about." "Corn," he said. "You were right about the corn." She laughed, and he pulled her back and kissed her again, and the corn question was tabled for another week, though in the end she was right about it and they both knew it. Spring came in with its usual violence on the southern plains, the thunderstorms rolling up from the south in enormous purple towers, lightning cracking the dark sky, the kind of weather that reminded you that the landscape you were living in had its own opinions about what happened there. Sallie had learned to read the sky the way her father had taught her, and she was rarely caught wrong-footed by the weather. Ezekiel had the same skill from his years on the trail, where bad weather could mean a stampede, and between them they managed the spring planting season with an efficiency that produced, by June, the best-looking crops her farm had put forward since she had taken it over. It was in April that Harold Cutter himself came to call. Cutter was a big man, north of 60, with the broad face and heavy hands of someone who had worked cattle most of his life, and had grown prosperous enough to stop doing so himself, but had never quite lost the physical stamp of it. He came in a good buggy with a driver, which was how you knew he was not coming for a friendly visit, because a friendly visit you came on horseback. He sat in her kitchen with his hat on the table and a cup of her coffee he had not been invited to help himself to, and he explained his position. His position was that the open range had served the cattle industry well for 20 years, and that the homesteader fences were fragmenting the grazing land in a way that was economically damaging to established operations, and that he would be willing to offer her a fair price for her 160 acres, which would allow her to relocate to town or back east, and that this offer was generous and she should consider it seriously. Sallie sat across the table from him with her hands folded and her expression entirely composed. "That is a very clear explanation of your position," she said. "Here is mine. This land is legally mine, paid for and filed and settled. I have improved it, cultivated it, and satisfied every requirement of the Homestead Act. I'm not going to sell it. Not to you and not to anyone. I would appreciate it if your riders would remember the boundary lines and stay on their side of them." Cutter looked at Ezekiel, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Your man might want to explain some business reality to you," Cutter said. Ezekiel said very calmly, "She does not need things explained to her. She is explaining things to you." Cutter looked back at Sallie. There was no warmth in his expression, and there had not been since he arrived, and for a moment she could see him calculating, adding things up. "The territory is changing," he said. "Women running farms alone is not practical." "I do not run it alone," she said, "and I would be interested to hear what my being a woman has to do with the legal status of my deed." He said nothing useful after that. He finished his coffee, stood, picked up his hat, and said he hoped she would reconsider, in the tone of a man who was not really hoping anything of the kind. She thanked him for coming, in the tone of a woman who was not really thankful. He left. Ezekiel came and sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment. "You know he is not finished," he said. "I know. He will try something else." "I know that too." She looked at her hands. "He always does, but every time he tries something it costs him. Lawyers, writers, time. I am not as easy to move as he expected, and that is frustrating to a man like him." She looked up. "I have been handling Harold Cutter for 2 years, Ezekiel." "I know you have." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I am not suggesting you cannot. I am suggesting we think ahead." She turned her hand over under his. "Then let's think ahead." What came next was less dramatic than a confrontation, and more serious than a simple dispute. Over the following 6 weeks, Sallie found that her access to the grain elevator in Caldwell had become complicated by a new policy that required a male cosigner on all accounts, a policy that had materialized out of nowhere, and that the elevator manager, a man named Potts who had always been pleasant to her, now could not quite meet her eyes while explaining. She found that her credit at the general store had been quietly questioned, that there were suggestions circulating in town that her farm was over-leveraged and at risk, none of which was true. Cutter was applying pressure through the commercial channels he controlled, which were substantial. He had not broken any laws. He had simply made her life considerably more difficult by leveraging his relationships with the men who ran the town's commerce. She went to a lawyer in Caldwell, a younger man named Marsh who had arrived from Chicago 2 years ago and who had not yet been absorbed into the local power structure. She paid him with eggs and early vegetables and some cash she had saved, and he wrote formal letters to the grain elevator and the store on the subject of discriminatory credit practices. The letters had weight because Marsh knew his law and the law was on her side even when the practice was not. She also wrote a letter herself to the Kansas Agricultural Commissioner's office in Topeka, detailing the pattern of interference with her farming operation. She did not know if it would do anything, but she had learned that documentation created a record, and records had saved her before. Ezekiel, meanwhile, went to work on the social architecture of the problem. He had a gift she had not fully appreciated until now, which was the ability to make friends without seeming to be making them, to have conversations in the easy currency of working men, at the livery and the feed store, and over the fence of neighboring claims, conversations that were not arguments but that positioned the facts in a certain way. He was liked. He was trusted, in the way of men who say what they mean and do not elaborate past the truth. And the story of what Cutter was doing, carefully and factually presented, traveled through the working community of Caldwell and its surrounds with the speed of anything that touches on basic fairness. By June, 3 neighboring homesteaders had formally complained to Sheriff Dolan about Cutter's fence-cutting activities on their own properties, and the combined weight of the complaints produced a response from Dolan that was less sympathetic and more legal than his previous positions had been. It was not a total victory. Victories in these things were rarely total. But the pressure eased, and the grain elevator restored her account, and the store returned to its normal terms. And while Harold Cutter did not become a different man, he became a less immediate problem. On the evening of the day the grain elevator letter arrived confirming the restoration of her account, Sally sat on the porch steps in the long summer evening and let herself feel the relief of it, the specific exhausted gratitude of a fight that has, for the moment, been won. Ezekiel came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and handed her a cup of coffee. "You did that," he said. "We did that. The lawyer and the letter and the commissioner, those were you. You talked to half the county. Talking is easy. The strategic thinking was yours." He looked at her sideways. "You are remarkable, Sally. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch steps while the light died out of the western sky in long bands of orange and gold, and the frogs started up along the low ground by the creek, and the first stars came out. He proposed to her in July. He did it at the kitchen table, which was where the most important things in their lives seemed to happen, and he did it with a ring he had traded for with a silversmith in Caldwell, a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone the color of the southwestern sky he had grown up under. He did not make a speech. He said that he loved her and that he wanted to spend his life working beside her on this land and building something with her that would last, and that he understood if she had concerns about losing her legal independence since a married woman's property rights were not always well protected under current law, and that if she agreed to marry him, he would sign whatever documents Marsh the lawyer thought appropriate to secure her continued ownership of the land. She stared at him. "You have already thought about the legal protections," she said. "Of course I have. It is your land. It should remain your land." She reached across the table and took the ring from his hand and turned it over in her fingers, watching the turquoise catch the light. "Ezekiel Barlow," she said. "Sallie Lawson," he said. "You are the most unusual man I have ever met. Is that a yes?" She put the ring on her own finger and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and what was in her face was something that had been building since October and that she had stopped fighting sometime around February, and that now, in the full warmth of July, was simply and completely present. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." They were married in September of 1880 by Reverend Hooks at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was attended by more people than either of them had expected, because they had discovered that they were each, in their different ways, better connected to the community than they had realized. Walt Briggs came with his wife Clara, fully recovered and moving with only a slight hitch that he said did not bother him, and Clara embraced Sallie for a long time and said into her hair that she owed this woman more than she could say, and Sallie hugged her back and said the debt ran the other way, and they agreed to disagree about it. Lawyer Marsh had drawn up a property agreement that Ezekiel had signed without hesitation, and the land remained in Sallie's name, though in practice the farm was theirs together in every way that mattered. Ezekiel had no desire for the legal form of it. He wanted the life, and the life was already his. The wedding was simple and direct, much like both of them. Sallie wore a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, not white, because white was impractical on a working farm, and she had never been interested in impractical things. She wore her hair up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, and she walked down the church aisle with Walt Briggs on her good arm, because there was no one else whose arm she would rather have taken. And when she looked at Ezekiel standing at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought for the occasion, and had already somehow got a slight dust mark on the left sleeve, she felt a joy so straightforward and uncomplicated that it almost knocked her sideways. When Reverend Hooks asked if she took this man, she said yes with such clear and immediate conviction that there was a ripple of quiet laughter through the pews, and Ezekiel's mouth curved in the slow smile that she had spent 11 months learning to distinguish from his other expressions, and that she had concluded was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They went home to the farm that evening, and it was their farm, which it had always been in spirit and was now entirely in fact. The first winter of their marriage was cold and domestic and close, and Sallie understood during those months something she had not fully understood before, which was that the quality of the silence in the house had changed. It was still quiet, but it was a warm quiet, a shared quiet, the quiet of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and move through the same space without collision. She had not known she missed that quality of company until she had it, and now that she had it she could not imagine the previous version of the house. He was a good husband in the way that mattered most, which was that he was present and honest and genuinely interested in her. Not interested in a managing way, not interested in a possessing way, but interested in the way of someone who finds another person endlessly worth paying attention to. He argued with her when he disagreed and backed down when he was wrong and occasionally dug in when he was right in the teeth of her considerable persuasive force, which she respected even when it frustrated her. He asked her opinion on things that most men of the era would not have thought to ask their wives about, and he actually listened to the answers. She loved him with a depth that still sometimes surprised her, that came up in ordinary moments, watching him fix a harness or reading at the kitchen table or laughing at something she had said, a full and certain love, built on genuine knowledge of the person rather than on hope or imagination. In the spring of 1881, she told him she was going to have a child. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her for a long moment and then crossed to her and put his arms around her with a careful intensity, holding her in the way of a man who is processing something very large and trying to do it without dropping her. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am very well. I have felt better in the mornings than I would like, but otherwise I am well." He pulled back and looked at her face. "You should not be lifting the heavy things, Ezekiel. I am aware that you will argue with me. I am asking you not to lift the heavy things. I will not lift the heavy things that are genuinely heavy. I will not stop farming. I do not expect you to stop farming. Good. But the really heavy things. Yes, fine." He smiled then, the full version, and pulled her back in, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him around her, and thought that her father, who had loved her more than anyone in the world for the first 21 years of her life, would have liked this man very much. The pregnancy was healthy and without serious complication, and in November of 1881, in the bedroom of the farmhouse with the assistance of Dr. Prentice and Clara Briggs, who had developed a practical knowledge of these matters over her own 2 children, Sallie delivered a boy. He was solid and loud and had, from his first hour of life, a specific and irritated opinion about the state of the world that suggested he had inherited something from his mother's side. They named him James, for Sallie's father. James Ezekiel Barlow, though they called him Jamie, and the name of the farm went from Lawson Farm to the Barlow Farm in the common speech of the community, though the deed still read as it always had. Ezekiel held his son for the first time on a cold November afternoon with the light coming through the bedroom window, and his face went through a series of expressions that Sallie watched from the bed with a drowsy and absolute attention, expressions that resolved finally into something she could only describe as wonder, open and unguarded in a way she rarely saw on his face. "He looks like you," Ezekiel said. "He absolutely does not. Look at that chin. That chin is yours. That chin is your mother's. I have seen the photograph." He laughed quietly, not wanting to startle the baby, and looked down at Jamie with the steady, attentive gaze he gave to things he cared about. "Thank you," he said. "You are thanking me. For this, for all of this." He looked up at her. "For saying yes." She reached out and touched his arm, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed with the baby between them, and they were quiet for a while in the winter afternoon. Jamie grew into a child of remarkable stubbornness and physical energy, who was walking at 10 months and talking in full sentences by 16 months, and who had the particular ability of certain children to identify exactly the thing you did not want him to touch, and then touch it with enthusiastic speed. He adored his father with the complete uncritical worship of early childhood, and was fascinated by his mother with the slightly more cautious awe of someone who recognized that she was a more complicated and formidable subject. By 1882, the farm had expanded. Ezekiel had put together enough, through the wages Sallie paid him, and a good sale of the first cattle they had bought together, to file on an adjacent 40 acres that bordered the west side of her original claim. They farmed it together and held it together, and it was a meaningful expansion of what they had built. The Cutter problem did not entirely disappear. Harold Cutter died in 1883 of a stroke, and his operation passed to his son David, who was a somewhat more pragmatic man than his father and who, after 2 moderately unsuccessful legal attempts to challenge the validity of the Barlows' water rights, decided that there were easier fights to be found elsewhere and largely left them alone. It was not reconciliation, but it was peace, and peace on the southern plains was worth something. The community around Caldwell was changing in those years. The great cattle drives were diminishing as the railroads penetrated deeper into Texas and Kansas. Farmers fenced more aggressively. The wide open range that Cutter and men like him had relied on was becoming a patchwork of claimed and bounded land. It was a transformation that hurt some people and created opportunity for others. And the Barlows, with their well-ordered farm and their expanding operation, were among those for whom the changing times had created rather than destroyed. Sallie had by now a reputation in the community that she had not sought and did not particularly manage, but that had grown up naturally from the accumulated facts of her history. People knew she had fought the land challenges and won. They knew she had ridden into town with a bullet in her shoulder and Walt Briggs across her saddle. They knew she had outmaneuvered Cutter's commercial pressure campaign. The women who had drawn their shawls tighter the day she rode in now came to her with questions about land rights and credit, and how to write a letter to a government office that would actually be read. She answered what she could and sent them to Marsh the lawyer for the rest. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as practical. But she had come to understand that the distinction between the two was sometimes thinner than it appeared, and that the kind of practical person she was, the kind who did what needed doing regardless of the cost or the audience, might, from the outside, look very much like courage. Ezekiel said so regularly, and she had learned to accept it rather than argue it, which itself felt like a small form of growth. In the summer of 1884, she found out she was expecting again, and this time she told him while they were walking the fence line of the West 40 together in the long evening light, the same place where so many of the things worth knowing had been said between them. He stopped walking. At her, he reached out and took her hand. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, which she had noticed was always his first question with significant news, not how he felt about it but how she felt about it. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Very much." They stood in the evening light with the wheat moving slowly and the warm summer wind on all sides of them and the sky going enormous and pink in the west. "Jamie will be furious," Sallie said. "Why?" "He likes being the only one. He will get over it." "He will not get over it immediately. He will be very dramatic about it for at least 2 weeks." Ezekiel smiled. "He gets that from you." "He absolutely does not. I am never dramatic." He looked at her with a deep and eloquent silence. "I am occasionally dramatic," she said, "in proportion to the situation." The second child was a girl, born in February of 1885, and they named her Me, for Ezekiel's mother Margaret called Me. Jamie had indeed been very dramatic about the announcement for approximately 2 weeks, and then had fallen completely in love with his little sister, with the totality that only small children can muster for a sibling they have decided is theirs. He was 3 years and 3 months old when Me arrived, and he took his role as older brother with a seriousness that made Sallie think she recognized something of her own quality in him after all, a fierce and personal sense of what he was responsible for. Me had her father's coloring, the dark hair and the steady brown eyes, and his quality of watchful attention, and she was quieter than Jamie from the start, but with a depth of observation that her parents learned early to pay attention to. Because when Me said something, it was usually worth hearing. The years built on each other in the way that good years do, each one adding something, each one changing the thing slightly, so that looking back from any distance the transformation was striking even though day to day it had felt like simply living. By 1887, the Barlow farm was 140 acres of well-managed farmland with a solid wheat operation, 20 head of cattle, a full working barn, and a house that had been expanded twice to accommodate the family and the reality of a life being lived fully in it. Ezekiel had built a proper room for each child off the back of the house, extending the original structure with the careful craftsmanship of a man who understood that things built with proper attention lasted. He had also built a small study off the main bedroom at Sallie's request, where she kept her records and her files and the letters she wrote and received, and where she spent an hour most evenings doing the paperwork that a farm operation of their size generated in considerable quantity. She had become the person neighbors came to when they needed help navigating the land office, or when they needed a letter written that would hold up to scrutiny, or when they needed someone to stand with them in front of a government official and not be intimidated. She did these things without thinking of them as a pattern of behavior, only as the next thing that was needed, but they had made her a fixed point in the community, someone people oriented themselves toward. Ezekiel saw this clearly and was proud of it in a way that she sometimes caught on his face when he did not know she was looking, a quiet, settled pride in who she was and what she did that had no possessiveness in it, only genuine admiration. He had his own reputation, built in the working community of men who dealt in cattle and horses and practical land knowledge, a man who could be trusted to give you a straight assessment, and who did what he said he would do, and who, when Cutter's son had tried the water rights challenge, had stood in the magistrate's office in Caldwell and given his testimony in the flat, clear tones of a man who is simply telling you what he knows and letting you make of it what you will. They were together, something that neither of them had been alone, which was not to say that either of them had been diminished before, only that they had each been something, and together they were more of it. One evening in the autumn of 1887, they were sitting on the porch after supper while the children were inside at the kitchen table, Jamie doing his letters, and me arranging a collection of stones she had gathered from the creek into patterns that apparently had significance to her, though she had not explained what it was. The air was cool and carried the smell of harvest, the cut wheat smell that Sallie associated with this time of year, and with everything that was good about the life she had built. Ezekiel was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Do you remember the first day, when you rode in?" "I remember it clearly. You came down that street and nobody moved, and you just kept riding like it was entirely normal to arrive in town with a bullet wound and a dying man. I did not have a better option available. That is what I mean. You see what is possible and you do it. You do not waste time on what is not possible." He looked at her in the fading light. "I thought that day that you were the most extraordinary person I had ever seen. You thought nothing of the kind. You had known me for 15 minutes. 20 by the time I thought it, but the thinking started at about 5 minutes. She looked at him. "When did you know, really know?" He was quiet for a moment. "The fence line. When you told me about the 3 legal challenges, and you said it as though it was just something that had happened, just a fact, and I could see in your face how much it had cost you and how little you were going to let anyone know that." He paused. "That was when I knew." She reached over and took his hand. "For me it was the freeze," she said. "The 3-day freeze. You worked for 3 days without complaint, and at the end of it you sat on the barn floor next to me and just let me fall asleep on your shoulder without making anything of it. And I woke up and you were still there. Where would I have gone? That is exactly what I mean." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, the gesture he made sometimes that was old-fashioned and deliberate and sincere, and she looked at him in the failing light and felt the same thing she had felt on that February afternoon on the south fence line, the recognition of something true. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "That I loved you. I knew before you said anything. I let you go first because I was frightened." "You? Frightened?" "Being brave does not mean you are not frightened, Ezekiel. It means you do the thing anyway." He looked at her and said quietly, "I know. I have known that since October of 1879. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch in the autumn evening listening to the children inside. Jamie's voice reading something aloud with the labored precision of a child learning, and Me's quieter voice occasionally commenting with the confidence of someone younger, but somehow more certain. The years continued to add themselves one by one in the way of years in a good life. Not without difficulty, because difficulty was simply the nature of the territory and the time, but built on a foundation solid enough that the difficulties had context and could be weathered. In 1889, the government opened the unassigned lands of the Indian Territory just south of the Kansas border to homesteading in what became known as the Oklahoma Land Run, and the movement of settlers southward changed the character of the Caldwell region, which had been the gateway for so much of that traffic. The cattle trade was largely over now, and Caldwell was settling into a quieter version of itself, more permanent, more agricultural, less wild in the specific sense that had made it what it was in 1879, when Sallie had ridden down its main street with a bullet in her shoulder and a dying man across her saddle. She thought about that sometimes, about how much had changed, about what the place had been when she first came to it, and what it was becoming. It was a common kind of thought for people who had been somewhere during a transition, who could hold both the before and the after in memory. Walt Briggs fully recovered and remained one of their closest friends, though he walked with that slight hitch in his gait that was the permanent souvenir of the morning in October 1879. And he told the story of what Sallie had done for him often enough that it had become one of the stories the community told about itself. The kind of story that carries a community's sense of who it is and what it values. He told it accurately, which she appreciated, and when he told it, people looked at her differently than the people on the main street of Caldwell had looked at her on that first morning. Clara Briggs had become her closest friend in the way that the wives of your husband's friends sometimes become, which is to say that the friendship had started as something adjacent and become something central. Clara was practical and funny and had no patience for nonsense, and they understood each other with the efficiency of women who did not have time to waste. The children grew with the relentless speed that children exercise regardless of how carefully their parents try to pay attention. Jamie was tall by the time he was 8, with his mother's auburn hair and his father's square jaw, and a temperament that was some combination of both of them, driven and deliberate, and capable of a great stubbornness when he had decided something. He had Ezekiel's patience in most things and Sallie's impatience in the specific category of injustice, which she thought was perhaps the most useful combination possible. Me was quieter and more internal, but with a depth of feeling that expressed itself in the art she made, sketching things, rocks and plants and animals, and the faces of the people she loved, with a specific and gifted observation. Sallie had found a way to have her formally taught by a woman in Caldwell who had studied art in the East, and the investment was worth it. Me bloomed under instruction, and by the time she was 6 had developed a discipline of practice that she applied to her sketching the way her father applied himself to work, steadily and completely. By the spring of 1890, the farm had reached a size and productivity that required making decisions about the future of it, about what they were building and for whom. Sallie had begun, in her evening study hour, to keep a more formal set of books than the farm had required before, tracking not just the current year but projecting forward, thinking about the land in the longer term of inheritance and legacy. Her father had thought about it too, in his own way, and she understood now with the clarity of distance what it had cost him to build something from nothing and how much care had gone into his decisions, even the ones that had not worked as planned. She talked about this with Ezekiel on one of the November evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the lamp was burning low on the kitchen table. "What does the farm mean to you?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. He thought about it for a moment. "It means a place," he said, "a place that exists and will keep existing, a place that the children will know and remember, a place where we chose to be." She nodded. "My father said something like that. He said the point of the land was not the land itself, it was what you did with it, the life you lived on it." He was right. I know, he was right about most things eventually. She looked at the lamp for a moment. "I want to expand again," she said. "I have been looking at the 80 acres on the east, the Hollies place. Hollies is talking about selling and moving to his daughters in Kansas City." "I know. I talked to Hollies last week." "Of course you did." She looked at him. "What did he say?" "He said he wants a fair price and a quick close. He is ready to go. We have the reserves for half of it. We could borrow the rest from the bank in Caldwell. We could. My credit is good there." "Our credit is good there," she said. He smiled. "Our credit. What do you think?" He looked at her across the table, this woman who had built something from grief and stubbornness and practical intelligence, who had fought for every acre and every right, and who had opened her hand and her home to him and made both better by his presence as he had made better by hers, and he thought about the 80 acres and what they could do with it. "I think we should do it," he said. "I think we should keep building." She reached across the table. He took her hand. "Keep building," she agreed. They bought the Hollies 80 acres in the spring of 1891. The farm was now 220 acres. And between the wheat operation and the cattle and the kitchen garden that Sallie had long since expanded from necessity into something that also served neighboring families who needed fresh vegetables in the summer and stored ones in the winter. It was a full and complex operation that took both of them working fully, and the seasonal help of 3 local men to manage during the heavy seasons. It was in that same year that Sallie delivered a 3rd child, a second boy, born in August when the harvest was at its most demanding, and the timing was, as she told Ezekiel with considerable dry amusement, extremely inconvenient. He did not find it inconvenient. He found it wonderful, though he also made sure the harvest was covered by hiring an additional 2 men for the season and managing the whole thing himself while she recovered, and he did it without being asked, and without making anything of it because it was simply what was needed. The new boy was dark like me, with Ezekiel's coloring and a disposition of cheerful and determined exploration that had them both watching doorways and staircases with an alertness that Jamie's more careful nature had never required. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that it was a strong and simple name that suited the solid, energetic person he appeared to be from the first day. Jamie, who was 9 when Thomas arrived, took his role as eldest with a responsibility that was sometimes touching and sometimes exhausting, as he had decided that it was his personal duty to explain the world to his younger siblings in considerable detail, and with considerable confidence, not all of which was accurate. Me tolerated this with the specific patience of a middle child, who has worked out that it is simply faster to let certain things go. Thomas ignored it entirely, having already decided that his own direct experience of the world was a more efficient educational tool than his brother's narration. The family they had built was noisy and particular and full of the specific friction and warmth of people who are genuinely known to each other, and Sallie loved it with a fullness that she had not known to want before she had it, that went alongside and complemented the independence she had never stopped valuing, because she had learned that the right kind of love was not the kind that asked you to trade one thing for the other. By 1892, Caldwell had changed enough that the world Sallie had ridden into in 1879 was more memory than present reality. The cattle drives were history. The saloons were still there, but they served a different clientele. The sheriff was different, and so was the doctor, Prentice having retired to Topeka to live with his daughter, and the grain elevator had changed hands twice. The town was more settled and more ordinary in some ways, and in that ordinarily it had lost some of the sharpness that had made it dangerous and also had made it alive in a particular way. But the land was still there. The land was always still there. One afternoon in the late autumn of 1892, Sallie walked the full perimeter of the farm for the first time in several years, just herself, on a clear cold day when the sky was that hard November blue that she associated with clarity of mind. She walked the east boundary of the Hollies addition, and the south fence line where she had first taken Ezekiel's hand, and the north boundary behind the barn, and the west line of the original claim. 220 acres, every foot of it known to her, every variation in the soil and the drainage and the wind exposure understood in the specific practical knowledge that comes from years of attention. She had a moment, standing at the south fence line with the wind in her face, of feeling the weight of it all, the entirety of what had been built and survived and grown, and she let herself feel it fully, which she did not always do. She had ridden into Caldwell with a bullet in her shoulder, and nobody had helped her except one man who had stepped out of an alley because he had not been able to keep himself from it. That man had given her the first thing she truly needed, which was not help with the horses or the directions to the doctor, though those had also been welcome. He had given her the first honest recognition of who she was and what she was worth, and from that recognition, offered plainly and without agenda, something had grown that was larger than either of them and was still growing. She was the bravest person in the territory. He had said so. He was the only one who ever had, at least the only one who had meant it the way it needed to be meant, not as flattery or strategy but as simple and complete truth. She was still standing there when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see him coming across the south field on the black gelding, older now and slower but still his, the horse he had ridden when she first met him, and that he had refused to part with on sentimental grounds she had never teased him about. He pulled up beside her and looked at her, looking at the fence line and the open Cutter land beyond it, which now belonged to David Cutter's son and was managed as a considerably smaller and more peaceable operation than the one Harold Cutter had run. "You have been out a long time," he said. "I was thinking. Anything worth sharing?" She looked up at him on the horse. He was 41 now, and the years had put some weathering in his face that had not been there before, but he looked to her very much the same as he had looked stepping out of that alley in October of 1879, the same steadiness, the same brown eyes with their quality of complete and genuine attention. "I was thinking about everything," she said, "the whole of it." He swung down from the horse and stood beside her. And it is good," she said. "It is very good." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the fence line and the open country beyond it in the cold autumn light. "The children are asking where you are," he said. "Thomas has decided he needs to demonstrate something to you involving the barn cat and a piece of rope, and I cannot determine whether this is ingenious or catastrophic, so I thought you should be involved in the assessment." She laughed. "Where is Jamie?" "Doing his homework under protest. Me is drawing the chickens again. She has filled an entire sketchbook with chickens. She says each one has a different face." "They do. She is right." Sallie stepped back from the fence and looked at her husband. "Let's go home." They rode back across the south field together in the November cold, the horses moving at an easy pace, the farm ahead of them solid and particular against the open sky, the smoke beginning to come from the kitchen chimney because Jamie, reliable in this as in most practical things, had started the supper fire the way he was supposed to do. It was everything. It was the whole of what could be asked for and worked for and held. Not perfect, because nothing was, but real and warm and built on the truth of who they each were, and who they were together, on the recognition offered and received in a November afternoon 9 years ago on a south fence line in the cold. Thomas's rope and cat demonstration turned out to be a reasonably ingenious pulley system that he had constructed to allow himself to open the barn door without getting out of bed, or rather without crossing the barn to the door, since he had been sleeping in the hay for the better part of the afternoon when he was supposed to be doing chores. He explained it with the complete unself-conscious confidence of someone who considers the ingenuity of the solution to be sufficient answer to any questions about the reason for its necessity. Sallie looked at it for a long time with an expression that Ezekiel recognized as the one she wore when she was simultaneously exasperated and impressed, and was deciding which to lead with. She led with the chores conversation, but she told Ezekiel later in the privacy of the bedroom that the pulley actually worked quite well, and she thought Thomas might have a mechanical mind. "He has your mind," Ezekiel said, "just applied to different problems. My mind does not design systems to avoid doing chores. Your mind designs systems to make everything more efficient. He is 9. The things he wants to make efficient are not always the things you would choose." She considered this. "That is fair," she admitted. He was reading, or had been, the book open on his knee. She was at the small table in the corner of the bedroom that served as an extension of her study when she needed to work after the children were in bed. She had a ledger in front of her, and a letter she was composing to the Topeka Agricultural Office about an unfair surveying practice that had affected 3 families in the eastern part of the county. She finished the letter and set down her pen and looked at him across the room. He had fallen asleep over his book, which happened sometimes, the book tilted against his chest and his head back against the pillow, and his face in sleep had the same quality of settled honesty it had in waking, no performance of any kind, just a person at rest. She blew out her lamp and crossed to her side of the bed and climbed in carefully so as not to wake him, and lay there in the dark listening to the house, to the particular sounds of it at night, the creak of Jamie turning over in his room, the sound of the wind against the eaves, the tick of the cooling stove, all the sounds of a house fully inhabited and fully alive. He woke when she settled, as he usually did, enough to put the book on the nightstand and turn toward her. "The letter," he said, half asleep. "Done. Good. Go back to sleep." "I am asleep." "You are not. I am very close to it." She put her hand against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm. He covered her hand with his. "Sallie," he said, "Ezekiel, I love you. I know I love you too. Go to sleep." He did. She lay awake a little longer, not with worry, just with the fullness of a life she had not expected and had built anyway, stubbornly and practically. And with more love than she had known, she was capable of when it was most needed. Out in a cold October morning with a bullet in her shoulder, and a man stepping out of an alley to help her because he could not help it. The wind was up from the south tonight, warm for November, carrying the smell of the dry grass and the distant promise of rain. The children were asleep in their rooms. The cattle were settled in the barn. The wheat was dormant in the ground, waiting for spring. The farm was there. The life was there. All of it built from the same materials that had always been available to her, which were attention and will, and the specific brave quality of getting up in the morning, and doing what needed doing regardless of what it cost or who was watching. And one man who had seen that quality for what it was and had told her so, plainly and completely, at a south fence line in the winter of 1880, and every day since. In the spring of 1893, the wheat came in tall and green across all 220 acres, the best stand they had ever grown. The children helped with the early work as they were able, Jamie with real competence now, me with the careful attention she brought to everything, Thomas with the chaotic enthusiasm of a 10-year-old who had recently decided he was capable of considerably more than anyone was crediting him with. Ezekiel moved through the planting season with the same unhurried efficiency he had always brought to work, and Sallie moved through it beside him, and they passed each other in the fields, and at the barn and over the kitchen table 100 times a day, and each time there was the same recognition, the same warmth, undiminished by familiarity, deepened by it. On a May evening when the wheat was knee-high, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with clouds and last light, all 5 of them were out on the porch watching it, as they often did with particularly good skies. Thomas was sitting on the porch rail, which he had been told not to do because it was unsafe, and was doing it anyway because he had calculated the risk differently than his parents. Me was sitting on the steps with a sketchbook in her lap, trying to capture the light. Jamie was leaning against the post with his arms folded, which was a posture he had developed recently that made him look so much like his father that Sallie had to look away sometimes. Sallie and Ezekiel were in the 2 porch chairs side by side, close enough that their hands could find each other on the armrests between them, which they did. The sky went through orange and rose and a deep violet that Me was working very hard to capture in graphite, which was an impossible task and one she was committed to anyway. "Mama," Jamie said. "Yes. Walt Briggs told me you carried him to the doctor." "I did. On a horse, when you had a bullet in your shoulder." "That is correct." He considered this. "That is the most impressive thing I have ever heard." She glanced sideways at Ezekiel. He was looking at the sky with his quiet half-smile. "Your father helped," she said. "I had only just met her," Ezekiel said. "The impressive part was entirely hers." "I could do something like that," Thomas said from the porch rail. "Get off the rail," said Sallie and Ezekiel simultaneously. Thomas considered his options and got off the rail, which was progress. The sky went dark and the stars came out. The enormous Kansas sky with its river of stars that you could only see properly away from town, and they stayed on the porch longer than was practical given that there was an early start required tomorrow, because the sky was too good to go inside away from. "I want to farm this land when I am grown," Jamie said, quietly, "not to anyone in particular." Sallie looked at her eldest son in the starlight. He was 12 years old and solid and serious and capable, and she thought about her father saying something similar once about the land and what it meant and the life you lived on it. "Then you will," she said. "With us," Me said without looking up from her sketchbook, though it was too dark to draw anything now. "All of us," Thomas confirmed from his new position on the porch steps, which was safer and therefore had been approved. Ezekiel squeezed Sallie's hand. She squeezed back. The night settled around the farm and the stars moved in their slow patterns above the Kansas prairie, above the 220 acres of worked ground that had been raw land and was now something, that had been one woman's stubbornness and was now a family's foundation, that had been a beginning and was now, fully and completely, and without any remaining thread left loose or any question left unanswered. A life. A whole, real, good life. Built on bravery and recognized by love, which is perhaps how the best things are always built. Sallie Lawson Barlow sat on her porch in the May evening with her husband's hand in hers and her children around her, and her land running away in the dark to every horizon. And she was, as she had always been, exactly where she needed to be.